Hi, good morning, and a very warm welcome everyone participating in this webinar. My name is Willemijn Keizer, and I am the Executive Director of the Netherland-America Foundation. The NAF is celebrating our 100th year of strengthening the bonds between the United States and the Netherlands through educational exchanges for Dutch and American students and scholars. We're sponsoring cultural exchanges, and we're fostering business ties between our two countries. This webinar is one in a series of occasional talks and lectures we host on business, cultural, and historical topics. Our next webinar will be held on June 27th. It will be a virtual concert featuring NAF alums Alicia Silverstein on violin and Xin Wan on harpsichords. This webinar, Differences in Diversity, is sponsored by TABS. TABS is a facilitator for hundreds of small to mid-sized European companies that are new to the US market or planning to enter the US markets, helping them establish themselves to become successful. With offices in New York and Houston, TABS assists its clients with their back office needs, offering HR support, payroll administration, company formation and compliance, bookkeeping, and more. We thank them for their support. To make all of our work possible, we ask for your support. Please consider becoming a member of the NAF or donate. If you'd like to learn more about the NAF or our NY Biz Chapter, please go to thenaf.org. We hope that you'll enjoy this webinar, and please join us for future NAF events. Annette van der Veld, over to you.
All right, thanks Willemijn, and thanks NAF for hosting this webinar. I'd like to start out that we have a Q&A box. So if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A. And Laura, the program manager of the NAF, will be monitoring the Q&A. If there's anything that needs to be addressed right now, she'll let me know. Otherwise, we'll answer your questions, and we'll try to answer all your as many questions as possible the last 10 minutes. So with that, I'd like to welcome everybody. My name is Annette van der Veld. I am an intercultural communication coach and facilitator. It's quite a word. I help Dutch companies and Dutch expatriates moving to the US, and American companies and American expatriates moving to the Netherlands. And I help them with intercultural communication. And so one thing I noticed when I talked to Dutch companies about DEI, DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I'll explain that more in a bit. I noticed that Dutch companies and American companies have a very different picture about what DEI is, and hence this webinar. So just setting the stage, DEI is here to stay. If there's one thing we've learned in this past year, it's that DEI is here to stay. We're all learning about it, and we're all struggling about it. And of course, adding the intercultural dimension makes it even more complicated. But we're going to address that in this webinar. It's a very sensitive topic, and everybody here is here with positive intent, but it's sensitive, and we might just get some wording wrong, or we might say something that somebody in the audience might find offensive. Please let us know. Again, we're learning about this, so let us know, put it in the Q&A, and explain, what better wording would be. I have lived in the US for 22 years, and I thought that my English was pretty good, but a while ago I was facilitating a webinar for Dutch and American, for a Dutch American company, and I talked about colored people, and the Dutch people didn't react, and the Americans immediately lit up the chat. Turns out that colored people is very offensive. The right term to use is people of color. So if we say anything insensitive, please let us know, and remember that we're all here with positive intent. So why diversity? Why DE&I? Well, McKinsey has done a study back in 2015 and 2020. They redid the study showing that companies that have a successful DE&I policy are 35% more profitable than companies in the same space who don't have a successful DE&I policy. Why? Well, it's very simple. You get people from different walks of lives with different experiences and different opinions. So you're going to increase productivity and creativity because you get all these different points of view. But the other thing is that successful DE&I also includes creating an atmosphere of belonging for every employee being able to bring their authentic self to work. And this, of course, decreases employee turnover. So what is DE&I? Let me just share my slide here. So what is DE&I? Well, D stands for diversity. And diversity means hiring people who are not like you, who are not like the majority of society, but hiring people who reflect what your society is made up of, what your customer base is made of. So hiring people from various minorities, religion, gender, sexual orientation, ability, both mental ability, physical ability, age. There's a lot of different diversity aspects. The E stands for equity, and that is something that is lesser known, and that's why I have this slide. Equity often gets confused with equality, and equality is based on giving everybody an equal share, as noted in this picture where everybody gets a box, but it's not very helpful. Equity is based on fairness, giving people what they need, which means some people get different things than others. So that's what the E in DEI stands for. And finally, inclusion. Inclusion means taking away all the barriers and allowing everybody to bring their authentic self to the workplace. And with authentic self, I mean that you can be who you are. You can dress, you, of course, within limits, but you can dress, show your hair, however you want to express yourself, and being allowed and accepted for that. So with that, I would like to introduce our panel. And it's been a lot of fun getting to know the panel. They are all very interesting, knowledgeable, and wonderful people. So on the panel, we have Ivo Futselaar. He is personally and professionally passionate about LGBTQ diversity. He's held various leadership positions in corporate LGBTQ employee networks in financial service companies, both in the Netherlands and in the US. He's currently a senior campus recruitment manager at L'Oreal, but he will be speaking on personal title from his wide range of experience. Rodney Lamb uses entrepreneurship as a way of making a social difference and always spreading the message of inclusivity. And he's done that as CEO and co-owner of the streetwear brand Daily Paper, a company that is run by young people with different ethnicities and a management team consisting of 80% women. And besides running a company, he also implements his vision in the realm of film. He is a screenwriter, a producer, and an actor, and he uses his storytelling to reflect on modern day society. Paula Robinson is the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Rabobank North America. She leads the organization's diversity continuum, servicing over 1,500 employees on maximizing the fullest potential of an inclusive workplace. She also serves as a thought partner to embed diversity, equity, and inclusion into the business infrastructure, the core organizational culture, and the impact on clients and communities in which the bank serves. And we also have Jennifer Tosh, who is a cultural historian and who I will give the floor to now. She will give us an introduction to DE&I. Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar, and thank you so much for the Netherlands-America Foundation for inviting me, including me in this amazing conversation and panel. I asked Annette to allow me to introduce myself because I also want to position myself within this conversation a little bit more. I'm going to share my screen here with you all. Now you should be able to see this. Great. So to introduce myself, I wanted to talk a little bit more about my corporate background. I think it's very relevant for this conversation. I have over 20 years of corporate experience in the United States, where I was born. My parents come from Suriname, my ancestors from Suriname. I've been living here in Amsterdam for the last 8 years. And so I have obviously a lot of history within the Netherlands. But my work in the corporate world spanned 20 years. For Visa International, I was a global marketing director. For Charles Schwab, I was a partnership relationship manager, and also a private consultant at Ben Harris and Associates as doing diversity work for corporations. And in 2013, when I moved here to the Netherlands, I started the Black Heritage Tours to amplify and make more visible the hidden histories of people of African descent and indigenous descent around the Dutch colonial empire. So that's just to give you a sense of my background, and it is important again that I position myself in that conversation. So my role for the next 15 minutes is going to be to give a historical context to DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion in the United States and in the Netherlands, comparing a little bit the differences, which Annette's in some way alluded to, talk about what we have learned from the last 20, 25 years, or even further back. And I also want to use some examples and case studies to show what has worked, what hasn't worked so well, and to give a bit of a futuristic view of what can the future of DEI work look like to help set the tone for the rest of our discussion. So just a bit of historical context. The principle of in the Netherlands, and when I moved here, 2012, and I was studying at the university here, I was very intrigued by the nuanced differences. Of course, having grown up in the United States, it was very interesting for me to be completely in a new environment. And I did a lot of research in preparation also for this webinar. And what I know about the Netherlands is that in 1983, the principle of the Equal Treatment Act was introduced into the Dutch Constitution. And according to the Article 1 of the Constitution, all persons in the Netherlands should be treated equally under equal circumstances, and no distinctions on the grounds of religion, belief, political opinion, race, sex, or any other grounds were to be prohibited. And while the actual treatment and non-discrimination function in relationship to is mostly about the state to the individual and not really referring directly to the individuals. However, there's this term that's used called the horizontal effect that was intended to include also the other aspects of equality based on religion, political, race, gender, nationality, etc. And I'm going to move through this a little bit quickly because one, I only have 15 minutes. And I can say a whole lot. So I'm not going to try to boil the ocean, as I often refer to in trying to do these, but just again, to give a little bit of historical context. So the ETA was actually not enacted for another 10 years. So it wasn't officially until 1994 that the Netherlands wasn't really protected under the civil anti-discrimination law until 1994. Before then, it was only protected on the grounds of gender, which I think is an important distinction. And in the Netherlands, diversity was really centered around gender equality. And of course, in later years, that was expanded. The other thing I think is important to note about that is that when we're talking about discrimination in this particular Equal Treatment Act, it wasn't using the term discrimination. So you'll read, if you know about this act, you'll see the term differentiation is more centralized, but they kind of, I think, try to suggest that there is some semantics in that. But there are distinct differences when we talk about differentiation versus discrimination. The differential treatment can be unequal and unlawful, even in the absence of intent. Again, I'm getting a little bit technical here. Whereas under the Dutch criminal law, the intent had to be proven. And so these terms, language matters, these terms get interchanged, but I think it's important to note that there are some distinct differences. In 2000, the year 2000, the Council of the European Union adopted a directive implementing the principle of equal treatment between persons, irrespective of race, ethnic origin, and the directive bans discrimination in various fields, including Social Security, social benefits, etc. So this just gives you a kind of an overall view of how this operates in the Netherlands. Now, when we go to talk about DEI in the United States, we have a much different view. It is heavily legislated. So in the United States, you have since 1941 was the first of 5 executive orders. So the president could sign these executive orders that would prohibit discrimination in various different forms. And I think that is a really stark difference between the Netherlands and the United States, is how much legislation has been built around this. Starting in 1941 with President Roosevelt signing the executive order, and then it would be Truman. President Kennedy signed one in 1961, 1969, Richard Nixon signed an executive order, all centered around that it was illegal to discriminate on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, national origin, and later on age was also included. In 1987, the Secretary of Labor, William Brock, commissioned a study of economic and demographic trends that became the landmark for this term that we now use, workplace diversity. So that's when you started to see the rise of this language change from just speaking about diversity or equality and equity to the workplace diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the idea being that Workforce Diversity 2000 highlighted 5 factors that would impact the US labor market and the motivation for companies to institute diversity into their policies. And the 5 impacts that they saw were the population, the workforce were growing at a rapid rate since, of course, the first executive order in 1941. The average age of the work population and the workforce was also rising, and the pool of young workers entering the labor market was shrinking. So baby boomers like myself were consuming, of course, the labor market, and that was making a huge impact. More women were entering the workforce, of course, since women's liberation movement that brought about those changes. Minorities were a larger share of the new entrants into the labor force. And finally, legal and illegal immigrants were representing a larger share also of the workforce since World War I. All right, so what does all that mean? A couple other things I want us to do to contextualize the conversation is nuances in language again. If you're familiar with diversity terminology in the United States, you might also be thinking, how does this relate to affirmative action? And for a very long period of time, the law that legislated that companies had to enact affirmative action into their policies. So there is a distinct difference between diversity and affirmative action. With diversity seeks to address the imbalances. Affirmative action actually legislated that. So the concepts first imposed on organizations were involuntary. You had to, by law, to facilitate certain rules in your hiring practices. And diversity is strictly is meant to be a voluntary process, deliberately trying to also, again, to reconcile the imbalances or address the imbalances within the workforce as well, and focus on hiring practices. So a lot has happened. What have we learned? Now, there is so much data that's available on this, and I could spend another 20 minutes just talking about the data, which I'm not going to do, I promise. But there are some key learnings. There are some things that it does not really address. It doesn't address the underlying structural oppression or inequalities in our societies. And I think that's more true in the Netherlands because it has not been as legislated in the Netherlands as it has been in the United States. And what I also found very much missing in the discourse is, and Annette, you did mention this term, is valuing the differences between us. So it becomes a question of, do we start with diversity first? Do we start with inclusion first, or equity first? And that could be perhaps the topic of conversation for the panel. Many companies also, especially in the Netherlands, see themselves as diverse, but are not really inclusive. So if you look at most corporate structures, at the very bottom, you have most where the diversity sits, but the higher up this pyramid, if you will, it becomes less and less diverse and less inclusive. And while this diversity movement has made lots of strides, there are still a lot of work that needs to be done. It's more than just acknowledging these differences in people. It involves recognizing the value and the added value that having an inclusive and diverse workforce brings to this idea of the bottom line. Of course, the companies, I've never met a company that wasn't focused on profit and profitability. And as Annette also mentioned, that being a diverse and inclusive and equitable company has shown repeatedly that it increases profitability. So I want to also then use a few case studies, because I found this very interesting, because how does this really operate? How do we apply, can we measure whether DEI actually works? I'll use, without naming too much, because I'm not focused on naming and blaming, but I want to use these examples to highlight the importance of, or how diversity has worked within certain companies. So there's a Dutch architectural firm that's based in the Netherlands, and some of you might even know the name, but I'm again not including that, that really promotes DEI in their mission statement, in their values, the corporate values, in their public image. $1 million contract to re-envision miles of this middle, it's called the Middle Branch waterfront area in Baltimore, in South Baltimore. And the Baltimore News reported that a city resident had identified online only as a Middle Branch citizen, so someone as a community activist, started to circulate a photo of this company. And the photo was of 3 white employees dressed as Black Pete. Now, most of you on the line probably are familiar with Zwarte Piet, or Black Pete, who is the Moorish helper of Sinterklaas, or Santa Claus. Sinterklaas is the patron saint here in the Netherlands. And it showed these the 3 people dressed as Black Pete and 1 person as Sinterklaas. Now, if you understand cultural differences here, for this American group organization, immediately set off the alarms. You can imagine this picture of the employees from this company that potentially would win a very large contract. And unfortunately, the result was that the company withdrew their application. They did release a statement that said that this was an anonymous email that was sent out. So we don't know who sent it directly, but that they vehemently denied that they were a racist company, which they were being accused of. That the company has also denounced that this was from 2012. So we're talking that the picture was taken in 2012 that was circulating. It appears in 2020, and shortly after the firm withdrew their application. And they have tried to restore their public image by sending out these press announcements. They condemned blackfacing, they condemned Zwarte Piet. They also were very much proponents of the Black Lives Matter, and there's a lot of mixed messaging that happened. So this is a case of how a company that promotes and believes in DEI, but that gets vilified because of something that happened in their past. A second case or example that I want to use for a moment is a Dutch university, the University of Amsterdam, which is where I'm attending as a master's student. There was a period in 2015, they had an Occupy the University movement here. And part of the movement, the objections were that there was courses that were typically favored by people of color were being cut. A lot of cuts within the faculty. And as a result of this Occupy movement in Amsterdam, there was another movement that emerged called the University of Color, that were demanding more diversity, more transparency in the staffing, in the curriculum. And through a lot of protests, they won actually this new branch of the university that would be filled, called diversity administrator. And this diversity administrator's role was really supposed to look at and address the inequalities within the university. It was a great success in the terms of what the organization achieved, but the results were very poor. So there was a report that had 55 different recommendations that was supposed to be implemented by the university. A later report that came out in 2018, only 5 of those 55 recommendations were implemented. And for the most part, it's missing in action. There has been very little action taken on this plan. So here you have another example of diversity being promoted, but yet not really implemented. And one last example I will use is a Dutch financial institution that has a very deep colonial history. And if you're familiar with the Dutch financial systems, they were one of the precursors to the predecessors of this current bank was a Dutch trading company, a financial institution that provided loans to plantations in the East Indies, as well as in South Africa. But when you look at their public profile today, they have transformed this very deep colonial heritage into promoting DEI as part of their core values. So they're not shying away from their colonial heritage. They amplify it quite clearly in terms of giving a lot of historical context, but what they have done is also use it as a platform to launch how they have transformed themselves. So you can see that it's not as important that they had this very deep colonial past, but how they've used that in order to fuel the future and the present. So just those 3 examples. And my last point is about the future of DEI. Reordering their priority, I think, is one of the takeaways that I came from in really exploring this. I have a whole list of ideas I think is more suitable for us as a panel. And I hope I've given you a little bit of context for how DEI has evolved over the last at least 100 years. And I'll turn it back over to you, Annette.
All right. Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was a lot of information and wonderful examples, especially about how your past can catch up with you, or and you can use that to your advantage, or it can be used against you. So thank you, Jennifer. And with that, I'd like to ask the panel. Jennifer talked about the organizations and their past. Who within the organization should make this DEI policy? Ivo, can you? And I'm frozen. Ivo, can you comment on that? Who within an organization should be responsible for DEI?
Yeah, that's. Well, it can be grassroots, but it can also be top down. I think, an example is that, for instance, from my own experience, I started with financial institutions in the US. I started an LGBT employee resource group, and it was a grassroots organization, which then got supported by the C-suite, and we got a spokesperson or like a sponsor for the group. That's an example. What I will say is that, like, if you're starting fresh, start with the top and start them communicating their goals, because what you see is and cascade your diversity goals down, and that can be depending on the size of the organization. I would say, like, if you're small, like if you're a business owner, inform your employees about like the importance of DEI and what the vision is. But if you're larger, obviously try to start hire a DEI officer that can work on DEI. It all depends on the size, but there are various ways. But I've seen top down, but also grassroots.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so there's a big difference between large corporations and small corporations, where DEI officer is located. Paula, you are a DEI officer in a large corporation. Can you tell us where you're located and should you be located? And I'd also like to ask you to compare that to where DE&I is located in Rabobank in the Netherlands.
Yes, first I want to just thank you for having me here in this panel. This is an honor to be here. And thank you for the question. So I am located in St. Louis, Missouri. We also have an office in New York, and we have offices across the nation here. But we are a Dutch financial institution that is doing business here in the United States. So where should DEI, the function, sit? And as Eva was just saying, the message should come from the top down. And I look at this in sort of a circle and encompassing this full circle, that it is top down, because our leaders set the tone, and we look to our leaders for what are we doing, what's the agenda, where's our company going. And it's not just setting that tone, but it's also living it and breathing it and eating it and sleep. It's all of that. And so when we see that in our leaders, see that it's something that they believe in, then the rest of the organization believes in that too. And so then you get the bottom up effect, right? So then you have the bottom up where they say, we see our leaders living it and breathing it. And so we want to be a part of that too. And then it's also middle out, because our leaders are also cascading down to their managers and middle managers to just, again, set that tone. So where the function sits, it's an interesting question, because it depends on the organization, right? If we're talking the evolution of DEI in organizations, it may start with a consultant that morphs into this position that can sit in communications, could sit in human resources, which could evolve and then morph into being part of the executive team. It depends on where an organization is in their DEI continuum. And I use continuum because this isn't just a pluck and plop and we stop there. This goes on, and it's not for the faint of heart. You have to really, really work at this, because as you said earlier, Annette, it's sensitive and it can be polarizing. And so how we work that in, it just depends on the organization and where that sits.
Hi, thank you, Paula. Rodney, you are currently the CEO of a company that is built on diversity, but you also have experience with diversity in large companies. Can you give us your view on where the DEI position should be within an organizational chart?
Well, the experience that I have is in corporations is like maybe 15 years ago. So it's with larger banks and telecom companies. And at that time, it wasn't really a thing in the Netherlands. Inclusion, diversity, these are words of the last 5 years, maybe. So 15 years, 20 years ago, you were just an employee. And I don't think that there was, people didn't even see the necessity in the Netherlands, because racism or discrimination, it was very hidden in the Netherlands. It's different from the US. The US is you're black, and there's this history of slavery, where in the Netherlands, my parents came to work here. When you're young, and you're at the start of your career, you're just happy to get a job, and you try to work your way up, and you try to look as everybody else. So I was like every other guy, wearing a suit at a bank. The difference is when somebody who's a white male takes his shirt off or his jacket off or his suit off, he's still a white male. When you're color, you take it off, and you're not the typical person that makes a career. And so if in that period, if it should have started with the C-suite to really have a good objective of how they would work with diversity. And nowadays, you know, we're living in an exciting time, you know, because you see it more and more often. What I see now is that, well, Daily Paper is a very well-known brand, so we're an interesting customer to have for banks and for accountants' offices. So when they come, we just pick the ones who have the most diverse team, and people know that. So if a bank comes and they don't present a team with women and people of color in the team, we just say no. And we also give them feedback, of course, you know, why we're not doing business with them. So, but like you have the study from McKinsey. I know PricewaterhouseCoopers is a company that's really working with objective in diversity, but it's not from the top or the bottom. You know, I think that it's successful when everybody in the company feels that it's a necessity to have it. And that's a really hard part, of course. You know, it needs to start somewhere, but when it's infiltrated in everybody's mindset, then it's I think then everything will be so much better for everyone. So and hopefully we'll see that in the future, in the near future.
Right. Yes. Thank you, Rodney. You touched upon the concept of inclusivity. Jennifer touched upon it, and you're now saying it's making everybody feel that they can be their authentic self. That is so important, that everybody can just be who they are. And as you mentioned, when you took off your jackets, you were suddenly different from the others.
Yeah, but it's also the basis of respect, you know. So and that's what I meant with, it doesn't start with the top or the bottom. It's me being different from my colleagues and still being accepted. And if I'm not Muslim, but if there's always this Christmas party and this Christmas gift. So real inclusion is not giving everybody the Christmas gift. Real inclusion is having that respect for somebody who wants to express their own faith, for instance, Ramadan, or being Hindu, and that's real inclusion, giving that space to people to be their authentic self and not trying to give them something, even if it's Christmas, which is a nice holiday, but if you give them a gift, which is a nice gift, of course.
Right. And here in the United States, it has become very, you don't say Merry Christmas anymore. You actually say Happy Holidays. And especially here in the New York area, we have so many different religions that saying Merry Christmas may be offensive to people. And I think that is one aspect of creating an inclusive environment. Paula, what is the Rabobank doing to create this inclusive environment, building on what Rodney said, Christmas parties?
Mm-hmm. It's a lot of talking. The more dialogue you have, the more understanding and awareness and respect that you'll have. And this is quite different from the days of old, when we would come and we'd work and we would do our work and we'd go home. And we really tapped into our intelligence, our IQ, when we brought ourselves to work. And we didn't always think about our EQ and our CQ, that emotional intelligence and that cultural competency. And those are the things that really are going to pave the way to make DEI work and make it sustainable, and that it has its longevity. So the more we talk about it, and the more we're open to talking about it, and again, this is hard stuff, but that is how we can create this environment of inclusivity. This is how we show people that they belong in the organization. We can say that you bring your whole self, but what does that really mean? When we have words such as we're looking for a culture fit, And that may sing the tone of, I need to fit within what the organization defines me to fit into. Reframe that, we would say a culture add. What perspectives can I bring in that are different from your perspectives? And as we see the results, we see what McKinsey has produced, we see what other organizations have produced, those diverse perspectives help yield more productivity, more inclusivity, and you see better results. So those are the things that we're doing here at Rabobank, is we just need to keep talking, and having those courageous conversations, no matter how difficult they are, and go in and know that consciously we can do something about that. Our fear taps into our brain. That's the oldest part of our brain, but our brain has also matured over time, and that's how we tap into that and say, what is it we can do? It's talking.
All right. I like it, talking and being very sensitive to the language used. Right. Yeah. Ivo, it is Pride Month. And for those of you in the Netherlands who do not know what Pride Month is, it's the month when there is well, actually, Ivo, why don't you explain Pride Month? And then how do you see Pride Month being used to create, foster, bring awareness to inclusivity?
Yes, thank you, and happy Pride, everyone. Yeah, so Pride Month originates actually from the Stonewall riots in the 60s, where a gay bar was raided by the police, and then the people that were there were so obviously angry after the fact that there were protests for days, and that actually some big milestone in the LGBTQ plus movement in the US. And that actually the great thing about it is that now you have all around the world like Pride marches. So, but it originates here in New York, and you know it's June, and it's Pride, and the great thing is that it's not just like only about the Pride itself, the parade. It's a whole month of celebration and awareness about, you know, the LGBTQ plus community. What you can do, you know, as a company, there are multiple ways, and again, like depending on the size, but what I've seen, like for instance here at L'Oreal, but I saw it also at other banks that I worked for in the past, is a whole schedule of events, you know, that during the month, so that are like also like panel discussions, posting articles on the internet, like what Pride really is, social events like pre-COVID, and hopefully they are starting soon again. Also participating in the Pride, if possible, in the March. I worked for TD Bank previously, we had a youth March. So it is really like showing whether you're an ally or part of the community, you know, it's something to celebrate for everybody, because that's what I think is that, especially in Pride Month, allies are incredibly important for any community. And I think that as you are thinking about like, okay, how do I incorporate D&I best practices? Okay, it's now month June. Maybe you have a small company, send out a message, you know, hey, everybody, it's Pride Month. You might not be aware of, for instance, that you have LGBTQ plus employees, or you might have employees who have a daughter or son that is part of the community. You know, even by showing your like, acknowledging that this is Pride Month, organizing events or sending out communication, not important like how large it is, but really showing that during this month, because that's what you, again, like we talk about belonging, you know, that's why when people say, oh, I'm being acknowledged, or a community that's important to me is being acknowledged in this month. And by the way, it's a great opportunity to have some fun events too.
Exactly. Once we can all go outside again. Yeah. And you already mentioned it, allies and employee resource groups. Inclusivity doesn't just happen. It needs to actively be promoted. There needs to be an infrastructure for employee resource groups. Jennifer, are you familiar with the difference between employee resource groups in the US and in the Netherlands? Employee resource group is a very big thing in American companies. Is that in the Netherlands? And do you want me to explain what an employee resource group is and allies? Or?
I have to say something about that because the last year, of course, I call it the Black Lives Matter effect. There's been a lots of emphasis on the resource groups, companies. I was commissioned by many multinational companies based in the Netherlands, based in the US, to speak about this sort of colonial history and helping companies, organizations understand, how do we get here to this where we are today. And I think resource groups are extremely important. They really develop this sort of corporate culture and what is and how different groups within companies can find resources and support one another, and also to advocate for themselves when there are cases of discrimination. And I don't want us to lose sight of the conversation in terms of the joining this webinar are mainly Dutch companies that want to do business in the United States or that already consider themselves to be multinational. Because what ends up happening, and there's a term that I ran across quite a lot, the paper tiger. So we have these policies, we've got, it's written into the corporate vision that we are diverse and equitable and inclusive. But then when I actually talk to people within the companies in the Netherlands, who also may work in the US organizations, what the experience is very different. So it sounds good, it looks good on the face of the public face of the company, but inside the company, something else is happening. And last year, some of you might be aware, there was a report in Dutch news that highlighted that there is still a high degree of discrimination in the Netherlands. Companies, that 2,000 employees were interviewed in from different companies, and I think the number, I'm just trying to get the actual data here, said that there was an alarmingly high percentage. So it said age, sex, racial discrimination remains a major issue in Dutch labor markets. According to the survey, 2,000 people carried out questions. 55% responded say they have still facing discrimination or microaggression, which can be really subtle forms of racism or discrimination. It's not overt, so it might be an offhanded comment. It might be couched in a joke. Oh, and then you get this rather typical response. Oh, you're taking it too seriously. You're being too sensitive. That's when you know that a microaggression has occurred. And that of the 55% of the respondents who still face it, feel that 85% that goes even up to 85% if you are not yet employed and you're trying to get a job. So then the discrimination enters when they read your name on an application, and one of the things I found extremely different and surprising when I, as an older learner, is how quickly when you're being interviewed, they will ask, oh, how old are you? Or do you have grandkids? Or where are you really from? And this is not considered problematic in the Netherlands. You would never get away with that in the US company. You could be sued. So of course, in the United States, it's a much more litigious country, but you're not legally even allowed to ask how old you are, if you're married, where you're from. These are not questions that are allowed in an application process, where that's still considered not a problem. And why can't we know this? We're just interested in getting to know you. So there is these distinct issues that have not yet really been resolved. And if you're a Dutch company looking to expand to the United States, this cultural competency that Paula referenced is extremely important to understand why this Dutch company was rejected because of this 2012 picture of Zwarte Piet and Sinterklaas. So understanding the differences is extremely important, but also using that as a mirror to self-reflect. What role does your company now play in this whole discussion? And it's not okay when there's a protest to all of a sudden jump on the diversity bandwagon because everybody is doing it and think, okay, we checked the box, we can go back to business as usual. Nothing's changed. And that is another response that I get a lot.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I think Rodney has a lot to contribute to the hiring of diverse, hiring of a diverse workforce, and making sure they are included. Rodney, can you build on what Jennifer just said from your experience with Daily Paper?
Yeah, I think when I started out, one of the first thing I did 4 years ago when I started out the Daily Paper is hire a very good production manager. So we started the process of finding someone, which was a very extensive process. And we eventually, there was this woman who came, and she, an applicant. And we did some reference checks. She gave some references, and then we got to the manager. She's Black, she's African. I think where's she from? But she's from an African country. So I called her former manager and I asked her, is she any good? And her former manager said, yes, she's so good, she should have been my manager. This is very typical, and this is something that even I have experienced. You know, I've been in a treadmill where I saw people who weren't as good as me making a faster career. So I take that as one of the examples, but really changed my perspective on who to hire, because there's this very big but pond of really able women who are so good at their jobs. And the other thing is, when you hire them, they're so much more grateful for the opportunity. So you get so much more hard work out of them. I saw this Instagram post. Now, my wife saw an Instagram post from this Black transgender woman. She's 50, and she said, who's going to hire me now? I hired her on the spot. You know, I just called her up and said, like, we need you. She's amazing.
Rodney, can I just interrupt? Was this in the US?
This was in the Netherlands, you know, yeah. And I think when you go to the US, it's less hidden. That's the thing, you know. We think that we're doing a great job in the Netherlands, but we're not. And in the US, people know there's so much more work to do. And so you can't come with your, like Paula said, you can't, Jennifer said it. You can't come with that mindset, like, we're already there, we're already doing everything very good. Go to the US and go about your own business in the same way that you do it in the Netherlands, because it won't work. There are some.
Ask you, Rodney, so you're basically saying you can't copy your DNA, your Dutch DNA, and implement it in the US. What would you change?
Well, it's also about practical things. You know, people in the Netherlands, they really don't know how big Juneteenth is for Americans. You know, because in the Netherlands we have something similar, which is kitty kotti, right, Jennifer? Which almost no white people, it's not a thing for them. But in the US, you're getting confronted with it, and you need to have a policy for it. What are you going to do for those people who want to celebrate it? So, for instance, we close a store. We have an extra discount on our online shop, especially for the people in the US. So you really, it's also about those practical things that you need to take in consideration when you write your policy, because or else it's like what Paula said, it's only words, it's only paper, it's not in action. So you really need to, it's more about acting than having it on paper.
Yeah, actions speak louder than words. Sure. Thank you. Ivo put up his hand. I would just like to clarify for everybody who doesn't know what Juneteenth is. That is June 19th, which is my son's birthday, but it is also the day that slavery was ended in the United States. And that is a holiday that is getting more and more attention. And it's celebrated every June 19th. Ivo, you wanted to build on something that Rodney said.
Yeah, and by the way, like L'Oreal did a great thing is that we actually have a cultural day that we can pick whatever is important to us. For every employee, if there's a day that, for instance, I take off second Christmas day, but so for every, whatever your background is, you have a day, cultural awareness day, that's what they call it. Yeah, I think a really important part is around your hiring practices, because I think that also, it's important to see that, to build that into your sourcing strategy. I give you an example. So I have a cousin, he has an HR advisory a company in the Netherlands, and I looked at all his employees and they were all white, and I said to him, like, why do you have only white employees? And he said, well, we didn't have any luck with attracting people that are non-white. And I said, well, you have to have an active sourcing strategy actually to attract them. And I think that is, and now, speaking as the recruiter here, that's, I've been in the US now for 9 years, of which I've been 5 years recruiting. Everything I do on a daily basis actually is all my effort goes into diverse D&I recruitment. And how do I attract them? You can't just wait and hope that people of different backgrounds are just coming to you. No, you have to actually proactively reach out to them. And that is the way, and if you start with like that proactive sourcing strategy, if all dimensions in that you, for instance, have here in the US, like, I focus on LGBT, Black, people with disability, diverse abilities, veterans and whatnot, like there are a lot of best practices, organizations to work with actually to attract that talent. And then the moment you have them in your you have that organization, then you have also that representation. And that's, a lot you can build up, I've seen it, like the moment you start having people in the teams that are of diverse background, things really change.
Right. And have them in the team, but also have the policies, have the measures, everything in place to fully include them, not having them adapt to the company practices, but having everything in place for them to be themselves, to practice their religion, to practice, as you said, their cultural heritage, to dress, have their hair the way that reflects their cultural heritage.
Yeah, I will tell you, like, the amount of time I've heard from people like, oh, this is the first time, actually you were not, but I thought you were, or like, I didn't know like that gay people were like so and so, like you, I can write a book about it, like the things that especially like Dutch people have said to me and the questions they ask, because that's another thing, is like they ask you anything, whereas in the US, like they don't, which I often find very refreshing, is not to have to tell, for instance, my coming out story to a random stranger, what Dutch people do.
Right. Yeah, that is something about the Dutch culture, which can be an amazing asset, but can also be it can be a very hard downfall, the Dutch directness and just asking questions. We only have 2 minutes left, and I see there is a question. Before we go to the Q&A, I would like every panel member in just 30 seconds tell me, what should Dutch companies be most mindful about when implementing DEI, DE&I, when they move to the US? So a quick answer, Paula, do you want to start us off?
Sure. As I mentioned before, cultural competency, understanding. There was a study done, this back in the 1990s, when Lexus, the car dealer, actually sent Japanese engineers to the US to understand what Americans want in a car. And they spent a long time here understanding what Americans are looking for in a car. Took that back to Japan, translated it into the Lexus that we know today. And look at where that company is. I mean, they really blew up in the 1990s in car sales in America. So it doesn't have to be cultural expertise. I mean, we would love, I would love to be there, with all cultures, but just understanding, having more of a cultural competency. So I think that if we, America, as well as the Netherlands, understanding the cultural differences in each country that can help us better understand what we should do and how we are expected to be when we are in those environments.
Thank you, Paula. That warms my intercultural communication heart. That's a great answer. Jennifer, and we're running out of time here. And we do have a question. Very quick question. What should Dutch companies be mindful about when implementing their DE&I strategy in the US?
It's important for Dutch companies to become really honest and transparent with themselves. Listening is important. Do not invalidate anyone's experience. I find this to be the most irritating thing about Dutch companies that I interact with, is it's this dismissive, it's not that. No, you're not really experiencing this, it's something else. That's not going to work in an American environment. So listening to people, also look at your corporate structure. When we talk about inclusion, it's not just about
Jennifer,
being included.
Jennifer,
but let me just say this, it's about the corporate structure at the top is usually all white men, and you're trying to legislate to govern this idea of DEI from that perspective, it isn't going to work. So really be transparent and start looking at your own, wherever you go in the world, you take your corporate identity with you. That's my last word.
All right, thank you. Yeah, that was one of the questions I really wanted to ask, perceived differences and experience differences. You're touching on that. Rodney, 30 seconds.
Well, I couldn't have said it better than the others, you know. It's so I'm going to yield my time, because I agree with Ivo on the sourcing of really good people, and what Jennifer said about hiring. Hire somebody with this mindset of inclusion in the top. When you're going to start over in the US, it's a new opportunity. So.
Exactly. Thank you. Ivo.
Yeah, I think I'm going to stick with the last thing I said, is around like build a diverse workforce and source talent from all dimensions to really create that the diverse workforce. I think that's super important.
I love it. Excellent. Excellent. I'd like to say excellent answers to all of this. Laura, are there any, well, there are questions in the chat.
Annette, I think that we are at time. I know that there are some questions in the chat. What I will do, with everyone's permissions, is I will forward the questions to you so that we can follow up on the questions by mail. I don't want to hijack everyone's time. I know that people have very, very busy schedules, and I apologize that the conversation was so incredibly interesting that we did not get to the questions earlier. But I want to truly thank our distinguished panelists. This has been so incredibly interesting and insightful. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise and for sharing your experiences. This has been a very important conversation. DEI is something that we're all learning about, every individual, every organization on both sides of the Atlantic. Well, more sides of every country, of course, but for the Netherlands-America Foundation on both sides of the Atlantic. So thank you so very much. We really owe you a debt of gratitude. And of course, thank you again to TABS, who was able to sponsor this webinar. And I hope that everybody has a wonderful rest of the Wednesday afternoon.
And thank you again to all the panel members. This has been wonderful and way too short. If you'd like to continue the conversation, you can find all of us on LinkedIn. And thank you to Willemijn and the NAF.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.